At the start of 2022, the speedrun world record for San Andreas was around 3.5 hours. Now, we have just seen the first ever completion of the game in under 3 hours. What happened between then and now to allow San Andreas to become so much more optimized? Was it a huge new discovery? Changing of rule set? Runners' skills generally improving? Well, it was all three of those actually. Hi, I'm English Ben, and today you and I are going on a journey to discover exactly what allowed San Andreas to be completed in under 3 hours.
After 5 years on the East Coast, it was time.
If you're a fan of this type of content, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that good shit. I make these type of video essays quite frequently, and have quite a few on the optimization of San Andreas over the years, which you're welcome to also check out. The San Andreas speedrun has been a very notorious one for years now. The game's length, complicated, non-linear structure, and extremely difficult and complex glitches allow for some of the highest skill ceilings speedrunning has ever seen. To master the San Andreas speedrun, you need to be serious and committed, and only a few have ever truly mastered it at various points in the game's history. The game has also evolved a lot over the years, from humble beginnings to glitches being discovered, to skipping entire missions, and eventually getting to a point where it's rare you will see a mission completed in the intended way. There's a lot to get your teeth stuck into, so let's start from the top. In early 2021, a new method of duplicating missions was discovered in San Andreas. This method was a large breakthrough, as before this method was discovered, duping missions in Los Santos simply wasn't worth it due to how slow or inconsistent the setups were. Now don't get me wrong, this new setup is extremely inconsistent. In fact, it's a frame perfect trick with only a 1 in 3 chance of success, even if you hit that perfect frame timing. And that 1 in 3 chance only lowers as you progress further into the game. If you're curious for more information on this setup, you can watch the video I made on it here, and then come back to us. Don't worry, I'll wait for you. Okay, hurry up. The difference with this setup is that you have almost infinite tries should you fail the setup, and the time between attempts is extremely short, meaning as long as you didn't take more time than just completing the mission the usual way, you would save time on each of the setups. This caused a massive conundrum, as there was a level of skill in getting this frame perfect trick consistently, which meant better players would consistently save time in their runs to further optimize the game. The problem is that there was now so much luck involved due to this 1 in 3 chance that many runners considered it to be extremely boring and not fun to actually do attempts. You could play perfectly and not get anywhere. The new route for Los Santos with all these dupes saved so much time that the old route simply wasn't worth considering for anyone looking to play at a higher level. As you can imagine, discussion on this topic was plentiful once it was discovered and shown to the community. Many argued their points. Split the leaderboards, allow mods to make the 1 in 3 chance non-existent, ban the strategy altogether, you name it. To start with, things stayed as they were. However, over time it was clear that the game was dying as a result. No high-level players were doing serious attempts anymore, as they simply didn't care to play the San Andreas lottery. Something needed to change. The change that ultimately came was a change in rule set, and it was a big one. For a decade, San Andreas speedruns required the in-game frame limiter to be enabled during the entirety of the run, meaning players had to play at 25 frames per second. That's right, San Andreas on PC doesn't even run at 30 FPS. It's 25. Awful, I know. The new rule set abolished this rule, meaning runners could use third-party software, such as RiverTuner, to set their own custom frame rate locks to whatever they liked. You might ask why this would be significant at all, and that's a great question. The reason is not because of what happens when you increase your FPS above 25, like you might think, but what happens if you lower your FPS below 25, say to just a handful of frames per second. Locking your FPS extremely low actually solves the 1 in 3 chance issue when using the new duping setup, and it also made the frame perfect trick significantly easier as there is much more real time between frames in the game, meaning you have a much higher leeway on the setup. This is what runners needed to up their game, as it not only meant skipping a ton of missions inside Los Santos, but also allowing for faster mission dupe setups later in the game, as runners no longer needed to go out of their way to do the usual setups, which are sometimes quite far away. They can do this new setup pretty much whenever they like. There's still plenty more to address though, as it wasn't just this single dupe setup that allowed for huge time saves in this speedrun. There were a number of big discoveries in later stages of the game as well. For this next one, I'll need to give you a quick rundown on how mission duplication works, so stay with me. The reason duping missions in San Andreas saves so much time is due to how the mission chains are structured. Take this set of missions for example. These are some of Ryder's missions inside Los Santos, all in the same mission chain. When you complete the first one, in this case home invasion, it then takes you to the second one, and so on and so forth. However, the game only cares about the number of missions in this chain that you've completed, not that you've completed specifically these 2 missions. Meaning that if you were to somehow complete Mission 1 twice, you would skip to Mission 3, as the game sees that you've completed 2 missions and assumes you must have done Mission 1 and Mission 2. This means that by duping a mission and completing it twice, you can skip the entirety of the next mission in the sequence. So what happens if you dupe a mission? Oh, I don't know, so there's 8 instances of the same mission running. Well, that's exactly what happens during Monster X8. You complete the desert mission Monster 8 times, skipping the subsequent 7 missions in the sequence, all shown on screen. Not only is this extremely difficult to do, as most setups only allow for 2 instances of a mission to run, extremely consistent as the game can crash very easily when you make it this broken, but on top of all that, there is another huge problem. Partway through this mission chain, right here, you need to purchase an airstrip in order to complete the notorious flight school. I'm sure most of you had very fond memories of this place from your childhoods. Even with all this mission skipping, you still must complete the flight school, no matter what. You cannot complete the flight school without purchasing the airstrip, and we've skipped the mission that allows you to purchase the airstrip. Hence the problem. Well, check this out.
I will castrate you first. Let's go! Yeehaw! You want Hey, you leave me and I kill your family! Carl Johnson, you are shit!
We'd be here all day if I explained the full technicalities of how this works to you, so instead I'll say this. If you're familiar with speedruns and know how instapasses work, it's exactly the same as that. If you don't know what instapasses are, the TLDR is that you start certain missions while inside of another mission, the game's code jumps to a certain point. In this case, buying this Badlands property is a mission, and buying it during this specific failure state of the local liquor store mission jumps you forward as though you have just purchased the airstrip in the desert. If you remember before, we need the airstrip and previously lost access to buying it the intentional way. So this glitch in the Badlands actually solves that aforementioned issue. After all that, what we're left with is every single one of these desert missions completely skipped. The next skip that we'll be looking at is called Riot x3, or as I like to call it, Gang Territory Skip Skip. At the end of San Andreas, before you can complete the final mission, you need to take over 35% of all gang territories in an extremely tedious and monotonous wave-based minigame. For a long time, a gang territory skip was nothing but a pipe dream, but eventually it became real. The final mission is actually 3 missions pieced into one, and the 3 parts sort of act as checkpoints. This means that if you die on part 2 and restart the mission, you start from the beginning of part 2 rather than the actual beginning of the mission. Part 1 is the start up until the boss fight with Big Smoke, part 2 is the escape out of his fortress, and part 3 is the final chase with Tenpenny. Due to these parts being separate missions as far as the code is concerned, and only the first part checking to see if you've acquired enough gang territories, a setup was discovered that duped the penultimate mission, Los Desperados, in a very specific way, which skipped end of the line part 1, hence skipping right to part 2, skipping gang territories entirely. Now this was great and all, but the setup was long. You had to complete Los Desperados in its entirety twice, and also do a lot of prep to make sure the skip went as planned, which took minutes. Eventually work began on a new idea, which was completing the previous mission to Los Desperados, Riot, 3 times to skip both Lost Desperados and End of the Line Part 1. Duping a single mission more than once was known to not really be viable for a long time, until several setups were found. The newest setup discovered was using the burglary side mission, which is much faster to set up than any of the previous methods, and also much quicker than the original gang territory skip. This meant that Lost Desperados, gang territory skip, and End of the Line Part 1 are all completely gone from the route, and good riddance because those parts suck. San Andreas isn't all huge skips though. There are also some recently discovered smaller tricks that don't save as much time, but are still really cool. Take this one for example. You know those extremely annoying races at the end of the Badlands segment? Check this out. What you saw there is actually a method of skipping the first race entirely, by driving to the end point of the race without collecting any checkpoints. So how does it work? Well, there are 3 main scripts to look at here under the hood. The first is what we will call the cutscene mission. This is a script that handles all of the cutscene stuff for both races. The second is what we call the race mission, which is a script that handles all the racing stuff, including the side mission races that you unlock after driving school, etc. The third is what we will call the mission triggerer, which is a script that will activate the other 2 missions we just discussed to progress the game. For example, if you've completed race 1, start race 2, etc. When you fail race 1, the mission triggerer triggers the cutscene mission to reset your progress so that you start the first race next time. If the race was failed near the end, there will be a special cutscene, which is used to remove the other races cleanly, as it would look weird for the cars to either stay stationary or despawn. However, if you are dead when this fail cutscene is triggered, your progress isn't reset properly, progressing the game so that the past cutscene is triggered and the second race is unlocked. What you end up with is a way to skip race 1 in Badlands entirely. It's worth noting that you can actually theoretically do this setup without needing to drive all the way to the end of the first race. The trouble is that if you attempt this method, you only have a single frame to die, as that's how long it takes for the game to catch up in this case. This means that if someone finds a way to either die or get busted on a specific frame-perfect timing here, you could in theory skip the drive to the end entirely, saving even more time. This doesn't save a huge chunk of time, as you need to reobtain your weapons later on, but it's a cool strat nonetheless. I'm sure this won't be the last time I make a video on strategy developments in San Andreas, as new stuff is still being discovered on a very frequent basis, considering the game's age, and that's what makes it such a fun game to follow in my opinion. Thanks for joining me on today's journey through time, and a huge shout out to Petrus for letting me use his footage for the video. I'll leave a link to his Twitch channel below the like button. See you next time.